There are just so many examples of how self-esteem, dignity, the ability to reach our individual potential is impacted by our ability to have a voice and make choices about our own lives. Albert Bandura, in his 2001 article on social cognitive theory, suggests that the capacity to exercise control over the nature and quality of one's life is the essence of humanness. Without at least a degree of control, we feel less human. In some ways, we become the object of others, left for others to decide what is best for the individual. One organization is deeply committed to always putting the essence of humanness first since its inception in 1976. Welcome to Small and Gutsy, a podcast featuring interviews with nonprofit and social impact organizations under $10 million. My name is Laura Whitkoff, and I'm excited and proud to be your host. My hope is that you love the stories as much as we do, and perhaps you will find needed services, a job, volunteer, or donate. Feel free to pass along any valuable information you hear today to others, and remember to send me the name of any organization you'd like featured at reachus@theintrinsicgroup.com. Westside Center for Independent Living, now known as the Disability Community Resource Center, or DCRC, began as a force for change in 1976. What's particularly unique and special about the Center for Independent Living is that it is a community-based, cross-disability, nonprofit organization designed and operated by people with disabilities. It runs under consumer control. Those who need and use the services run the operation, meaning that people with all types of disabilities directly govern and staff the organization, providing services like peer support, information and referral, individual and systems advocacy, independent living skills training, and transition support. Today, I have the great privilege of interviewing TJ Hill, Executive Director, and Board Secretary Lisa Gooden. So let's get started. Welcome, TJ and Lisa. Share your passion about DCRC and what led to your involvement.
Thank you. Well, sure, I'll start. So we started as one of the first independent living centers in the world. The independent living movement originated in California, up in Northern California in the Bay Area. And we started a year after them. So the first independent living center was 1975. We were 1976. It was the beginning of the independent living movement. And what's interesting about our center and the independent living centers across the United States is that we were nonprofits that were born of a social justice movement, right? We were part of a civil rights social justice movement that started in the late 60s and early 70s. And the reason it started here in California was because we had some of our first students being admitted to the UC system that were people with significant disabilities for the first time, being admitted into the college system. And once they graduated, they realized that the world was just unequal as it was when they entered college, right? And so there was no opportunities for employment, engagement in most social, activities. This was well before the ADA.
ADA stands for the Americans with Disabilities Act, which became law in 1990. The ADA is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life, including jobs, schools, transportation, and all public and private places that are open to the general public.
And most of our sort of disability rubric of thinking about disability was focused on veterans returning from war with injuries. Mm-hmm. And so there was a very much of a sad charity model sort of associated with disability. And certainly people that were born with disability were like in another level of sad, charity model, right? And so these first people that, went to college, they were like, hey, this isn't right. How do we do this? And so in California, we had the opportunity to do that through the Department of Rehabilitation. People with other disabilities, born disabilities that were not veterans, decided to sort of become a part or were by default a part of that system. They realized that there was a need for something bigger. And that's where the independent living movement started. And that's how we got our beginnings. So it's a really beautiful sort of arc of social justice and history that defines who we are today and who we're going to be in the future.
And it does reflect, I think, on the aspect of what's the humanness part of what is going to fulfill an individual potential. And here you have folks who've gone to college, gotten advanced degrees, and were stuck until this movement really pushed it forward. It's really remarkable and beautiful, actually, that it came to that fruition.
Absolutely.
Lisa, tell me a little bit about your involvement and your passion.
I'm in a unique position to serve on the nonprofit board of the DCRC. I'm a commercial real estate attorney, commercial leasing by practice. I went from full-time to part-time back in 2017, and I wanted to become more involved with disability advocacy because of a family member who is disabled with profound autism. That experience, especially within the last 4 to 5 years, where the profundity of the autism became more apparent, opened up a whole door into issues affecting the disabled community who are adults or young adults, affordable housing, access to services. What happens once that young adult turns and ages out of the special educational system at age 22 for purposes of California, and other states it might be 20 or 21. What is also unique is that I have an outsider-insider experience of being an immigrant. I immigrated to the United States 35 years ago from the Caribbean, Jamaica in particular. Have become more or less, if you want to call it, westernized to a certain degree, but it offers me the perspective to have known about what my concept of America was, but yet I also have the experience of living here long enough to still see the disparate impacts of the availability of those resources to the underserved communities. DCRC is a perfect place to focus my energies and interest in the mission of ensuring the disabled, whether it's mental health, whether it's a physical disability, not just mental, our homeless population, for example, disproportionately, suffer from mental challenges. So it's the wonderful organization, one with a history, but one with a renewed sense of passion. And we need more visibility. We need to get more people on board to what our mission is outside of our stakeholders. So it's a wonderful opportunity right here, right now. The time is right. Doesn't it feel right?
Yeah, it feels right.
Doesn't it just feel right, TJ, from the point that you came in, the months cycling up to where we are today? We have a president who did acknowledge and talk about, the disabled as part of, the stakeholders within our US of A as an underserved population, which is huge. So my interest, again, there is a bit of, it's driven by emotion. It's driven as a parent. It's driven as an advocate. It's driven as an immigrant. It's driven as a person of Afro-Caribbean ancestry who, having lived here for 35 years, observed discrimination and was a subject of discrimination as well. And then you have built on top of that the challenges that, say, for example, a young Black male, such as my son, with autism, can be perceived as a violent, threatening person. And what can happen to that young man if the proper mitigating steps aren't made to ensure his life. Those are my lens.
Your story, Lisa, is so wonderful because the experience of being othered, both by your own experience and then witnessing it around your son and wanting to be protective in a slightly different way. I also have a son who's on the autism spectrum, so this really comes close to home in a lot of ways.
I've been on now at the DCRC as the executive director for a little over 2 years. When I came into the organization, I saw an organization with a deep and rich history, 400 in the United States, over 600 worldwide. This is really a social justice movement, right? And it all started here. And so for me, having been involved in disability rights, I'm a person with a disability, not a visible disability, but I have multiple learning disabilities, and I was othered from a very young age. I also had a sister with a significant physical disability. She had cerebral palsy, and she was othered in a different way than I was othered. Coming into this in a leadership role, into the organization, I was very conscious of sort of where we had been as a movement and who we had left behind. Who we left behind unintentionally, I'm sure, were a lot of the communities that Lisa's speaking to. The communities of color, it's communities who do not have access to resources. And it's also the narrowness of defining disability, which initially in our movement was very much defined on physical disability. You had very few people from any sort of extended definition of disability from what we sort of know as today. Certainly not including mental health, certainly not including developmental or autism or any other non-physical based disability. The tent is big enough, right? Like if we look at the country, 25 to 30% of Americans have a disability. So that's a lot of us, right? And so we all have these stories. We all have the stories of either being an individual who has a disability that maybe hasn't been, identified or put out as a disability, or being a parent or a brother or a sister, to somebody who has a disability, having our parents age into disability. There's this huge spectrum of people that are part of our movement, even if they don't know they're part of our movement. For us as an organization, this was the beginning year. COVID-19 could have thrown us into a whirlwind, right? Could have sunk our organization, honestly. I mean, there were so many threats to the nonprofit sector. And I looked at it as wait a second. This is a unique opportunity that hasn't happened in our country for well over 200 years. What can I, as a leader in this organization, and what can we as an organization really learn from this moment? And what I learned was the tent is big, right? And the need is great. I'm so honored to have people like Lisa who come from, their personal experience, who, tangentially, I might be related to sort of this idea of independent living and how it really impacts communities. And it's no, Lisa, you are the embodiment of what part of our independent living movement is, which is raising up communities and creating a more equal space for people to not only survive, but thrive.
TJ, you mentioned, so beautifully said, you mentioned the response during COVID. And I'm wondering if you'll speak to that a little bit, because like everybody else, you had to adapt to it, and particularly with your community where it's in some way all about adaptation. And so share with me some of the things that you had to do during this time.
So it was a quick learning curve for sure. We realized that there was a pandemic that was impacting our community and that was going to impact our community probably earlier than anyone else in the country. So we closed our doors and went completely remote within the first week of March. We were seeing it in our community right away. And so I made the decision, look, we need to move to remote operations. But then what does remote operations for independent living services mean, right? We started providing all our support groups online. We had, all of our community support groups became Zoom groups. We were doing individual meetings with people. One of the things that really early emerged was the need for personal assistance services in people's homes that were going to be able to get them up and get them ready and make sure that they don't go into congregate living and into hospital settings. We noticed that as right away was an emerging need, and that only amplified over the coming months. So there were a lot of things that emerged from what are the needs of our community that made us really put our ear to the railroad tracks and with a locomotive coming at us, right? So yeah. it was like how do we assess this need and quickly, and it was scary. And we saw many people of our community quickly succumbing to COVID-19, which was heartbreaking. And we knew that we needed to do everything we could to support our community. So we adapted things like providing food assistance, and that opened up this another layer of how great food insecurity was within our community. That was something we probably weren't really aware of before, but certainly became pronounced under COVID-19. Another thing that came about, the digital divide. We had no idea how certain communities, particularly communities of color that were being most impacted by COVID-19, didn't have the resources to be able to connect to us digitally, right? We created a digital bridge project to get laptops out to the community, to people, and get them internet access so that they could access our community supports and get those kind of that infrastructure put in. But all of that stuff was things that we hadn't thought about before, and COVID-19 definitely made us adapt.
And to touch on TJ's point, the reason you probably didn't have to think about it before is that a certain degree of the disabled community who may not have the resources at home for launching or getting onto the internet, well, they used to go to the libraries and Starbucks and places where you had free Wi-Fi.
I think so many communities experienced that same thing when things shut down. I also want to commend you for your early responsiveness, because clearly your heart for the community was the priority and safety. And so you thought, okay, we got to shut down. And then all of these things emerged that now I imagine will be mainstays in terms of the program delivery aspect that you want to keep going even post COVID-19 when, hopefully all of us are vaccinated, which I think is remarkable. There are truly silver linings, even in things that feel absolutely horrific, we would never want. But here's an example of where the responsiveness that your organization came forward with is spot on.
And TJ didn't touch on the employment category of the services provided by DCRC. And as you know, with the COVID, the lower skilled employees, mostly people of color, but just generally across the board, they're the ones that lost their jobs because places shut down. They're the ones who the places did not shut down are continually exposed. The heavy burden that we had and the success actually in the employment sector for DCRC, that's going to have to be double timed, right, TJ?
Yeah, and we're excited for that. I mean, again, there's been some beautiful lessons out of COVID-19, which is so hard to sort of reconcile with all the tragedy and loss that our community has experienced. But the amazing things are, first of all, understanding that our community, the people with disabilities, are a vital part of the economic landscape of the United States. And were heavily relied upon during COVID-19. Our employment services continued full steam ahead during COVID-19. And we were placing people in employment, safe employment, good employment that was essential workers that were keeping, our society going. One of those things I'll go to is we had a gentleman with a developmental disability that we had placed at a grocery store as a grocery store clerk, as a bagger. And when COVID-19 happened, the grocery stores understandably were nervous about sort of what was going on. And they really struggled with how do we keep him on part of the team, but also keep him safe and explain all of these new protocols. So his employer, because we'd worked with them, reached back out to us and said, I don't know if this is going to work. And we said, no, absolutely, this can work. And we'll send a job developer in there to help him and work and model and make this work. And I can't tell you that one of the most beautiful things, again, going through all this horrible tragedy, to have this guy who had an obvious developmental disability. There were people in that community that had gone to that grocery store and they got to know him, right? And to see him there every day gave them hope through this whole COVID-19. And it was this wonderful thing. And I'm like, that is on a micro level, it's fantastic that he got a job and we maintained his employment. On a macro level, the impact that he had socially in our community and to transform people's thought about disability and how people with disabilities are essential. We're not disposable. We are part of our community and we're essential parts of our community. He was a local hero. And I hope that message is the thing that really transcends the bigger picture about why we do what we do.
What a fantastic, fantastic story all around, as you said, from the micro to the macro, and what it did to both raise awareness. It gave hope within the disability community because they could see what he was doing. It gave a visibility and hope beyond that because he is an essential worker and continues to be an essential worker. And I hope for most people, when we go to the grocery store, we realize that those folks are putting their lives every day at risk points that those of us who just go to purchase don't necessarily have. And so it really speaks to what you're saying. And I love that the organization stepped up, stepped in, stepped around, and really supported this individual on multiple levels. I want to hear about the other programs and services you offer. And I'd love to hear, you shared you have a disability yourself. And what makes you all unique is you employ folks who have a disability. So not only they're like insider outsiders, and it's a fantastic model. So I'd love for you to speak to both of those things.
Part of the independent living movement and the charter, if you will, for independent living centers is that we are peer run. That is the whole basis of our existence. I had learning disabilities and was excluded from the beginning as much as you could possibly think, put in special education, worked my way out of special education into mainstreaming. I was told when I was a little child, the term they said was, he was educationally retarded. I would never graduate high school. Well, I graduated law school. So I proved them wrong. And that's not to say that, I overcame my disability. I always hate that when people say that. Because I didn't. I learned to live with my disability, and I learned to incorporate my disability as a whole piece of my identity. And that has a very outsider experience for those of us that have navigated traditional employment through our lives. So there was a time, even while I worked within the disability rights movement, even in those sort of higher echelons of policy work or wherever I was at, watching the inauguration today was very emotional for me. I worked in Washington for a senator, and I worked on disability issues. And so I've been in those, but I was always in sort of that higher echelon of the disabilities stuff. And I don't think fully recognized as being a person with disability, or if I was still the only person in the room, right? And now that conversation is starting to change, I think, through diversity initiatives and really understanding that diversity is not about tokenism. It's about, integrating our whole community into the national dialogue. That didn't exist when I was growing up. Coming in to be the executive director of this independent living center, the Disability Community Resource Center, all of a sudden, in one day, I am surrounded by my peers. All of us. I mean, majority of us. The minority of us in the center do not have disabilities. Equally on our board, 50%, 51% technically of our board has a disability. And that's all by design in some aspect, but it allows for this really beautiful personal evolution. And so whenever I hire a new employee, and I've had the lucky opportunity to be able to do that, the honor to hire new people in as I've been at the center. And I always like to talk to them after that first year, and inevitably the conversation comes to that. And it's like, I never experienced working in an environment where my disability was normalized.
Yes, beautifully said.
Where
that's so great.
It wasn't an issue. It's weird if you don't have a disability. Right. What? Wait, like you don't have a disability? And we actually have members of our staff who have in staff meetings and stuff had to come out publicly as not having a disability, but just believing in the work that we're doing. And everyone's like, oh, it's okay. Like, you know, don't worry. You might get a disability later in your life. There's a good chance you will. It's like, you'll be a part of the group someday. In the realness of it, it's such this beautiful thing. And so it allows for this to employ people with disabilities that haven't had that evolution and haven't had that moment, which I didn't experience until, just a few years ago, is the most beautiful, wonderful thing. And that is also what we try to model to the rest of the world. Like, hire that person. And what's the worst thing is going to happen is you're going to have to be like, oh, we have to modify the job a little bit. Like, that's probably the worst possible outcome. The best possible outcome is you're going to have a diverse workforce.
And a dedicated, loyal individual. I can speak to my own son who has an incredible work ethic, right? Absolutely. I wish you could bottle that, because having the experience of being othered by having a typical experience, right, is such a new experience for so many people who have never been in that position before. And it is eye-opening. It's empathic building.
How about being othered within an underserved circle? Let me break it down. The environment I grew up in still to this day heavily stigmatizes not only mental illness, but a physical disability. The more higher you go on the socioeconomic level in terms of education, the more accepting you are of disabilities, because you have a worldview. There's still a lot of work to be done, even within our underserved communities, on how they view disabilities. When you split those communities racially, whether it's Black, Asian, Latino, Native American, they each have their own way of how they view certain disabilities.
Yeah, there's a cultural component for sure.
Like in my culture, it's changing, because I finally saw a news story about a man who only had one leg, right? And one arm, but was a farmer, would ride his bicycle 5 miles to the farmland, farm, sell his produce, and on weekends cycle another 5 to the family he had who lived down the hill. He grew up with the disability. He was ostracized, went to live with his grandma who had a farm, and she just taught him every day. Has a family with 5 kids, 4 of them in university, right? Wow. So then you have that, but then you have within the same subculture someone who has a mental disability, right? Mental illness, just plain mental illness, and who inevitably becomes homeless. Growing up, the term used for folks like that where I'm from was, oh, that's a mad woman. That's just a mad woman. That's just a madman. You're literally almost taught to not see them. So now I come to America. It's still a sign of weakness to disclose a mental health disability. And in certain professions, it's a kiss of death. You're a doctor with a mental health disability, you're not going to practice anywhere.
Right. So the effort to break through that stigma is part of the raising of awareness that I'm hearing DCRC is about.
The beauty of it is that we now have a wider cross-section of people in America. Maybe it's more predominantly in some states than others, the openness to recognize that, okay, I'm me, they're them, but we're all together.
Right. We're a community.
Right. And that could be me. A year from now, I suffered a tragic accident. Or that could be me at a mental breakdown. Stuff happens in life, and that could be me. And with that awareness, a wider acceptance, and then wider support. A lot of work to be done, but the world's our oyster, TJ. we just have to we just have to work with certain challenges that we have in the state of California. Housing pricing, affordability of housing puts us, the disabled category, below low income in terms of qualification for low income tax credits. So if I'm a developer and I want to do the right thing and punch through all the steps to create affordable housing and I want tax credits, I have to wait for like maybe the 2.5% of the amount of tax credits allocated for the state of California and then broken down maybe by city and then wait for everybody else to get theirs before I can get mine for disabled housing, not just low income. So there's certain challenges based on what states you live in, what cities, what hurdles you go through for certain types of services. But then I'll flip that because I'm the parent of a child with, again, autism. I've found that the state of California is probably the best one for disability resources in terms of the knowledge going back decades on special education, supports, whether it's social skills, occupational therapy, physical therapy, adaptive physical therapy, whatever it is. But here's the flip side. If you're not sophisticated or resilient enough to punch through and question and don't take no for an answer, you won't get all your resources.
Really an excellent point, Lisa. And I'm wondering too, for folks, so DCRC can help with that. I'd love to know about the resources that you offer, because if someone doesn't feel that they've gotten the services they need, share with me some of the services that you offer for folks.
Sure. So there's two sides of that. One is what I call the direct services, independent living services, which are, again, those peer-based, reflective, I've been there, I know the system, let me guide you through. That's a huge part of what we do, whether it's understanding the Social Security Administration rules and navigating people through that, or connecting them to legal advocacy if they need that level. A lot of low-income folks who need corrective lenses, right? Just need eyeglasses. They can't get those because they don't have the insurance that will cover it. So they come to us and they say, these are all my challenges. This is what's going on. And so we'll connect people to AT resources. And AT is everything from eyeglasses to walkers and crutches and wheelchairs and all those kind of things that just allow people to integrate their disability and be able to access community. So that's a big part of what we do. And it can deal with things like transitioning people out of nursing care into living in the community with their own community supports. That's sort of like, the golden egg of independent living center, work is like, if we can move people out of those nursing, hospital, institutional care settings and living integrated into the community. We have a adaptive housing program. So we will go into people's homes and put in, grab bars in their bathrooms, or modify their bathrooms, or put a ramp up into their, doorstep, or something like whatever those kind of adaptive needs, so that that person can continue to stay in their home and live and age in place in their community and continue to be a part of their community. Like, that's so essential. So those are the basics. Like, that's the inner, like, one-on-one services. But then there's the advocacy side, and independent living centers have been a big part of changing the cultural conversations around disability, right? We are engaging policymakers. We're involved in local commissions. I'm speaking to our mayor's office here in Los Angeles all the time. I'm talking to our county board of supervisors about the bigger policy stuff. I live in Santa Monica. How do we make that accessible? Like, we're a beach community. With the city of Santa Monica, I developed a grant. I wrote a grant proposal to use recycled materials to make into these beach mats that we could roll out to the beach. So now those are all over California. They're all over Los Angeles.
I didn't know that, TJ.
Yeah, it started with literally a dream in the shower one morning.
Right. I noticed that when you changed your name from independent living to include the word community, and I just would love to hear, it feels very intentional to me based on this conversation today.
Changing the name to Disability Community Resource Center was an intentional act to use language that we knew was universally identifiable. Mm-hmm. So to put disability up front, right? Yeah. We're proud of our identity. We're proud of our diversity. We're proud of the big tent. Community, we are members of your community and we're serving your community. Resources, we were like, well, resource, that's what we do. People come to us from the disability community to find resources. Mm-hmm. And then finally, center is we are a center of our community. And honestly, in where our offices are located in Mar Vista, we have become, especially amplified during COVID-19, this hub for community engagement.
And TJ, don't forget to touch on the fact that we have a wide service area. For anyone listening here, don't think that this is just Santa Monica, Mar Vista. Please, TJ.
There are 6 independent living centers in the county of Los Angeles, which only is reflective of how large Los Angeles County is. Mm-hmm. Most counties have 1 or 2, if they're lucky, independent living centers. We have 6. We were the only one, although we sort of identified ourselves as the West Side Center. We were pretty much serving all of Los Angeles when we had started. Our service area ranges all the way north to Malibu, south to San Pedro, and east to West Hollywood. Quite a large area and population dense area.
I thank you both for incredible information that is both useful, interesting, eye-opening, awareness-raising. So now for the round of quick, gutsy questions. So you spoke a little bit about funding. So this one, you're going to be like, do I have to answer this question? What is at the top of your wish list, but the answer can't be money or funding?
Community engagement. That has been the best gift I've received as the executive director. Has been seeing the interest in what we do. And every time we make a new engagement in communities, whether they be underserved communities that we haven't traditionally serviced before or long-standing community partners, that community engagement ultimately leads to more resources and more opportunity for us to reach more people, which is our thing. So, yeah.
And it leads to money. You had to put that in there. I heard that. Lisa, what about you? What's at the top of your wish list for DCRC?
It's to have complete assurance of title ownership to real estate assets.
I love that. Okay. It's tied to resources, but with a different angle. I love it. If you were to think of a song that describes DCRC, what would it be?
Wow. I'm so excited. And I just can't hide it.
TJ, I don't know if you're going to be able to top that one. Sorry, but
I'm definitely not going to sing because I won't put all the listeners through that torture for me. But mine would have to be probably "Freedom" by George Michael. That's my anthem for the DCRC.
And DJ, I have to make a comment on that because I started this podcast talking about the definition of humanness. Freedom is part of that. Freedom to make choices, freedom to fill one's potential. And so I really appreciate that. Tell me, what makes your organization gutsy? Because it's definitely gutsy.
So without sounding cliche, from our inception, we have always been the outsiders. And so from the inception, we've always been mavericks. I continue to think of us as mavericks, mavericks in every space that we go into because we are that new voice or that unheard voice. And we amplify it, and we amplify it proudly and loudly and with confidence. And so that's probably, I think, what still makes us gutsy.
I love it. It's great. Lisa, what about you? What are your thoughts?
Gutsy. I'm still new. I joined the board and the organization in August. Where I'm from, I know I keep going back to Jamaica, but the older I get, I can't help it. Where I'm from, we have a saying, "We little but we talawa." Talawa means we stand tall and strong. DCRC feels like that to me. We are little, but we actually tall and are strong. The future is bright for us, just like that little island nation, Jamaica, that somehow everybody in the globe knows that we exist. Only 3 million people in Jamaica, right? The same can occur here. So I don't have one word to describe it. I'm sorry. But
No, that's great. I love the saying. What is something outsiders or maybe even insiders don't know about DCRC?
So this sounds so counter to sort of who we are as an independent living center, but I don't think that outsiders and probably a lot of insiders, until they get to know maybe me and the rest of our staff, understand that we are an organization of people with disabilities working for people with disabilities. That pure connection, I don't think people really get it. I notice it even when I'm having meetings with, government contacts and things like that, big policy meetings. Like, they'll know that, oh, I'm the executive director of the organization. And then when I speak as, well, as a person with a disability and, and like from in our community, and I start saying those kind of like little words, I'll get the cocked heads in the meetings and they don't really connect it. And I'm like, yeah, like we are a disability organization through and through.
There's so much power and empowerment in that model in so many ways. Lisa, what about you? Is there something that, and I know you're fairly new as you shared, but is there something that outsiders or maybe even insiders don't know?
It's very easy for an outsider to assume that DCRC is no different from maybe a committee out of the mayor's office. And I was guilty of that. When I heard I was invited to join the board of DCRC, I did not know who they were. Been in California and Los Angeles for 30 years. Never heard of them. So if that's me and I consider myself, I kind of know the areas around LA, certainly worked in public entities, worked in private entities, real estate, nonprofit endeavors.
Well, hopefully after this podcast, even more people will have heard of you. That's my wish. Okay, so my last, quick and gutsy. If you could get one celebrity or influencer to endorse or talk about DCRC, who would it be?
Kamala Harris.
We're going to hashtag her on this podcast. Let's see what happens. You never know.
And she's been very supportive of actually the disability rights and our independent living movement. She is connected to it and knows that. And so I hope that she would be supportive of the Disability Community Resource Center. I would say Selma Blair would be my other choice, because when she announced her disability, she spoke as being a person with a disability, which was instead of, I have an illness and this is what I'm going through. She spoke about it as I have a disability. To me, it represents, that young, vibrant, sexy Hollywood, and she's a mom, and she's sort of all that identity that you want in a disability spokesmodel.
All right, I'm going to have to hashtag her too. Let's see what happens. So I want to thank DCRC and our amazing guests, Lisa and TJ, for speaking with me today and bringing to light the many facets of resources available.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful opportunity, and I enjoyed the conversation today, especially on this historic day of the inauguration. It was really lovely. Thank you.
Yes, it's been an utmost pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our blog of these small and gutsy nonprofits and small social impact organizations can be found in the organizational stories section of the Intrinsic Group website, so that we can continue to link clients, volunteers, future employees, and donors to this small but mighty network. Of course, we can't take responsibility outside of our own vetting of the organizations we interview, so before you sign on to support or work for them, we encourage you to do your own due diligence and research them as well. We just want you to learn about the small and gutsy nonprofit and social impact organizational sector so they can spread their story and their very impactful work. I want to thank my partners in this endeavor, the Intrinsic Group, a management consulting firm specializing in guiding organizations to leverage talent and optimize processes, the volunteers, my co-producer, sound engineer, and composer, Pavel Franson, and my graphic designer, Nate Addy. Please check out their bios on the Intrinsic website, and all the folks, friends, and family who have guided and inspired me. And thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, please share it with your friends, give us some stars, and write a review on wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you're interested in sponsoring Small and Gutsy to keep it going, please reach out to me at reachus@theintrinsicgroup.com. Thank you for listening. I'm Laura Witkoff. Take care. Bye for now.